Why did everyone stop talking the moment she entered the room? Ara Vance felt the shift in the air long before she heard the snickers. They weren't loud, just sharp enough to pierce the silence of the barracks at Fob Kestrel. She kept her steps steady, her face calm, though her fingers tightened on the handle of the long, heavy rifle case she carried. It was strange how something as simple as a weapon could turn an entire room into a whispering hive. The sun outside had baked the metal roofs until the heat clung to every surface. Dust hung in the air like powdered gilt. She crossed the aisle between bunks, quiet as a shadow, and set her rifle case down beside the narrow locker assigned to her, a space too small for a woman who had once carried nation secrets in silence. "What'd she bring, a museum piece?" someone whispered. Someone else chuckled, more like a broken stick. She didn't react, not outwardly, but inside a familiar ache stirred, not anger, not shame. It was something quieter, a resignation she had learned to live with since the day everything went wrong, since the day she had been told to disappear. She opened the rifle case. The room went still. There it was, the weapon everyone seemed to have been waiting for. A battered rifle with a hybrid soul. A scarred green stock fused to modern metal. A barrel worn to dull gray. A precision scope perched on mismatched rings like a king's crown balanced on a beggar's head. Corporal Thorne approached first, grinning with the confidence of someone who had never been humbled by anything real. "What in the world is that thing, specialist?" he asked. "Did you win it at a county fair?" A few soldiers laughed. It wasn't mean laughter, not really. Just the unthinking noise of people who didn't know any better. Ara lifted the rifle with slow, deliberate care. The bolt, polished from years of use, slid home with a sound like a secret being sealed. "It works," she said softly. 3 simple words, no defensiveness, no explanation. Thorne snorted. "Sure it does, just don't point it at anything important." More laughter followed him as he walked away. Ara didn't look up. She didn't need to. She lived long enough around soldiers to know the pattern: ridicule from the insecure, silence from the unsure, avoidance from those who sensed something about her they couldn't name. She finished assembling the rifle and leaned it against the locker like a sentry standing guard. It didn't belong here. Neither did she. Her transfer orders had been abrupt, too abrupt. A day's notice, a flight from a facility with no signage, a quiet handoff of documents full of blacked-out text, then a new assignment, logistics clerk, ammunition tracking, a role so beneath her experience it almost felt like a joke. She hadn't laughed. She simply moved where they sent her. But not everyone at Fob Kestrel appreciated anomalies. Colonel Hayes entered the barracks like a blade of ice slicing through warm air. His boots landed with the weight of authority, his gaze sweeping across the bunks with surgical precision. Soldiers straightened instinctively, breath held, eyes forward. Then he saw it. He stopped mid-stride, jaw tightening, hands curling into fists. "What," he barked, "is that abomination?" Ara rose, standing at attention. "Sir." Hayes didn't look at her. He stared at the rifle as if it were a stain on the floor. "This," he said, tapping the crude seam where old polymer met cold metal, "looks like something an insurgent would cobble together in a cave. Where is your service-issue rifle?" "In storage, sir. My orders authorize me to." "I don't care what your orders say." His voice cut sharp. "This thing is a disgrace. I will not have it seen on my base. You are reassigned." Ara didn't blink. She didn't argue. She didn't remind him that her orders outranked his preferences. She simply waited for the verdict. "You will report to the range master," Hayes said. "Your new duty is permanent range maintenance. You will sweep brass, patch targets, stay out of sight." A momentary pause. "Is that clear?" "Yes, sir." He didn't salute. He didn't nod. He simply turned and left, leaving the scent of irritation in his wake. Behind her, the whispers started again. "Range which?" someone muttered. Broken rifle girl. Ara lifted her battered weapon with steady hands. They could mock the rifle. They could mock her. None of it mattered. Mockery had no teeth when you had faced death without blinking, when you had lived a life defined by silence, shadows, and secrets no one at Fob Kestrel would ever know. But still something inside her tightened. A small ache at the center of her chest, the familiar feeling of being out of place, unseen, misjudged. She breathed it away. Outside, the Afghan sun hit her like a hammer. The firing range stretched before her, a long scar in the earth, littered with brass dust swirling in restless spirals. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't respected. But it was quiet, predictable. And she needed predictable. For weeks she swept casings until her arms ached, reset steel plates until her fingers blistered, patched targets while others trained, yelled, missed, and boasted. Nobody thanked her. Nobody asked her name. She was background noise in a place obsessed with noise. They thought she wasn't watching, but she watched everything. She watched the valley's wind curl down the ridges like invisible hands. She watched the shimmer of heat distort the world from the ground up. She watched the snipers, the pride of the base, fight their rifles instead of learning the landscape. They rushed shots, misread mirage, misjudged gusts. They were good, but they weren't great. They didn't understand patience. Ara did. At night she sat alone on the berm with her notebook, a small leather-bound journal full of numbers, angles, sketches, and patterns. Not feelings, never feelings. She didn't need to write those down. They lived quietly in her chest, unspoken. Wind speeds, temperature drops after sunset, humidity shifts, pressure dips before dawn, mirage flow along the valley floor. Every detail mattered. And in the silence of those nights, with the faint chill settling over the desert, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. But purpose didn't erase isolation. Every morning, the soldiers still laughed at her rifle, still whispered when she passed, still viewed her as an anomaly they didn't understand, the quiet woman with the broken gun. And every time she heard them, a small voice inside her asked a question she tried to ignore. How long would she be the outsider? How long before someone truly saw her? She didn't know. And she didn't know that the answer would come soon, sooner than she expected, in the form of a disaster, a humbling failure, and a challenge no one was ready to witness. A challenge that would not only expose the truth of who she was, but remind her of the part of herself she had tried so hard to bury. Why did the valley go silent the moment the general arrived? Ara felt the shift long before the convoy rolled through the gate. General Peters, a two-star with a calm gaze and a reputation for seeing through people, stepped out onto the range with an entourage of officers and aides. His presence was a pressure in the air, subtle, heavy, expectant. Colonel Hayes walked beside him, stiff and desperate to impress. He had polished every surface, rehearsed every line, arranged every moment to showcase the elite reputation of Fob Kestrel. But sometimes, even the most carefully planned performances crumble under the weight of something as simple as the wind. The automated dynamic targeting system, the ADTS, had been Hayes' pride project. Tracks ran along the far ridge, hidden behind rocks and brush. Steel silhouettes popped up for seconds at a time, designed to simulate enemy snipers. It was cutting edge, expensive, and Hayes wanted to show that his snipers could dominate it. Except the valley had other plans. Ara watched from the shadows of the range shack, broom in hand. The wind was restless today, rolling down the mountains in unpredictable gusts. Dust danced across the ground in jittery spirals. The mirage shimmered like a living thing. To her, it all made sense. She could see how the wind curved, where it pooled, where it stalled. To the snipers, it was chaos. Sector 4, 1,500 yards, the range officer called. Sergeant Davis shouldered his sleek government-issued rifle with practiced confidence. His scope was state-of-the-art, his gear pristine. He looked born for this moment. The target popped up. 4 seconds. A single breath. A single chance. Davis fired. The bullet vanished into the wind. A plume of dust kicked up several feet wide of the target. Miss. Hayes clenched his jaw. The general raised an eyebrow. Davis fired again. Miss Jensen followed. Another. Every shot was swallowed by the gale, disappearing into the shifting currents. After 20 minutes, 40 shots and 40 failures, Hayes' face had turned the color of stone. The snipers stood embarrassed, muttering excuses under their breath, gusts, ammo inconsistencies, the ADTS being too advanced. But excuses didn't change the truth. They had been beaten by the valley. The general looked bored, already disappointed. Hayes' reputation, his pride, his carefully engineered image, all of it was slipping through his fingers. And still, nobody looked at Ara. She stood behind the shack, invisible, broom handle resting lightly against her shoulder. She watched the wind curl around the distant ridges. She felt every shift in the air against her cheek. She knew exactly where the bullets were going. She knew exactly why they were missing. And she knew exactly what she could do. But she said nothing, until she heard Davis mutter the words that made something inside her stir. Nobody can make that shot today. Nobody. Ara's jaw tightened, not with anger, just recognition. The kind that comes when a door creaks open in your mind, revealing a room you've kept closed for years. She stepped forward. A soft voice, barely above a whisper, cut through the chatter. "Permission to try, sir." Everything stopped. Every head turned. A silence so heavy it felt like a weight settled across the range. Even the wind paused, gathering itself. Thorne snickered, the broom lady with her junk rifle. Hayes turned toward her, his face contorting with embarrassment and fury. "Specialist, get back to your duties," he hissed. "You are embarrassing yourself." But General Peters, intrigued, raised a hand. "Let her." Hayes' face drained of color, but he couldn't refuse a general's command, not even a subtle one. He swallowed his pride. "Fine, one shot, make it quick." Ara nodded. She didn't move like someone nervous. She moved like someone remembering. She walked to the firing line. No theatrics, no adrenaline, just quiet purpose. She lay down on the dusty mat, ignoring the fancy bipods and digital tools scattered around her. She placed a small canvas sandbag under the rifle stock. She closed her eyes. The wind brushed her cheek. She felt it shift, rise, dip. She saw the mirage slide sideways. She heard the distant clatter of a loose metal sheet on a rooftop, a far-off signal of a gust high above the valley. She opened her notebook, glanced at a single page, and made one tiny adjustment to her elevation turret. 1. "Target up," the range officer shouted. A silhouette appeared, dark against the bright ridge. 4 seconds. Ara's breath slowed. At the bottom of her exhale, she squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked. A second passed. 2. 3. A faint metallic ping drifted back across the valley. "Hit," the spotter shouted, voice cracking. "Center mass hit." Silence rolled over the crowd. Hayes stared, speechless. The snipers looked shattered. Thorne's mouth hung open. General Peters smiled, not with surprise, but with recognition. But Ara didn't celebrate. She didn't even look up. She simply worked the bolt, cycling the empty casing out with smooth, practiced grace. It wasn't pride that kept her face still. It was muscle memory. Old habits rising from beneath the surface of her quiet, self-imposed exile. Hayes stormed toward her, desperate for control, for an explanation, for logic where none existed. "That was a fluke," he snapped. "Anyone can get lucky." Ara said nothing. He pointed toward the mountains, toward a tiny glint halfway up the far ridge, a forgotten 10-inch steel plate from old surveying work. 2,000 yards, he said coldly. Hit it. A pause. Not once, 10 times. A ripple of disbelief swept through the soldiers. Even Davis shook his head. Impossible, ridiculous, cruel. The wind snarled across the valley, taunting her. 2,000 yards. Over a mile. A shot most snipers train their whole lives just to attempt. And 10 in a row. Impossible. But Ara didn't react to the challenge. She didn't object. She didn't doubt. She simply adjusted her body, sliding the sandbag forward an inch, her movements calm and deliberate. Then she reached for her hand-loaded rounds, cartridges built with the precision of a jeweler and the devotion of a monk. The valley quieted around her, as if waiting. Hayes, still furious, was handed a tablet by the general's aide. He scanned the classified file that unlocked before him. His eyes widened, his breath stilled. He looked at Ara again, truly looked. And for the first time since she arrived at Fob Kestrel, he understood exactly who she was. And exactly how wrong he had been. Why did the world around her disappear the moment she settled behind the rifle? Ara lay prone on the firing mat, the dust rising gently around her as if even the earth understood what was about to happen. She didn't hear the whispers. She didn't feel the dozens of eyes staring at her. She didn't register Hayes' pale shock or the general's quiet, knowing interest. All of it faded. All that remained was the rifle, the wind, and the distant glint of steel, a small 10-inch square suspended against a mountainside more than a mile away. She chambered the first round. The bolt slid forward with the subtle resistance of finely tuned machinery. The scythe, her scythe, fit into her shoulder like it belonged there. Like it always had. The valley was loud in its silence. Wind curled down the ridges. The mirage shimmered, revealing invisible rivers of heat. The sagebrush flickered as variations in pressure danced around them. She had charted this valley for weeks, every current, every shift, every quirk of its unpredictable breath. But this wasn't practice anymore. It was a return. Ara closed her eyes briefly, letting her heartbeat fall into the steady rhythm she once lived by. The rhythm of a ghost who had vanished into quiet anonymity the day her final mission ended in fire and shrapnel. She wasn't meant to come back. She wasn't meant to prove anything again. But something inside her stirred, the part she had tried so hard to bury, the part that felt alive in the stillness before a shot. She opened her eyes. Far behind her, Colonel Hayes stood frozen, staring at the tablet in his hands. The classified pages told a story he had never dreamed was unfolding under his command. Operation SBCTRE. Call sign Ghost. Highest long-range confirmed impacts in program history. Mission records filled with distances that seemed impossible. And a final line that stung like a blade. Status: retired from active operations due to severe injury. Recommended non-combat reassignment for mental and physical recovery. Hayes looked up from the screen, horror and awe twisting together in his expression. He had made her sweep brass, patch targets, carry out menial work in front of soldiers unworthy of her legacy. He had humiliated a legend. And now he was watching her reclaim a part of herself he had never deserved to witness. Ara breathed in. The wind curled over her cheek, a soft, cool whisper. She fired. The bullet began its long journey, 3.5 seconds across a mile of shifting air. Ara didn't need to wait for the sound. She already knew. A faint, delicate tink floated back to them. Hit, the spotter shouted, voice cracking. Dead center, confirmed hit. Gasps rippled through the crowd. But Ara didn't pause, didn't celebrate. She worked the bolt. Second round. Another micro-adjustment, 1 click left. The wind had shifted only slightly, but she felt it like an instinct burned into her bones. She fired. Tink. The spotter could barely speak. Hit another hit. By the third shot, fear and awe had hollowed out the sniper's expressions. Their world, their pride, their understanding of what was possible, it was all unraveling. Tink. A third perfect strike. Davis stepped closer to the spotting scope, as if needing to see the impossible with his own eyes. Fourth shot. Tink. Fifth. Tink. Ara moved like a machine crafted from calm discipline, every movement identical, every breath calculated, every press of the trigger a quiet echo of a life she had sworn to leave behind. But she wasn't aiming. She was remembering. The sixth shot echoed across the valley. Tink. By now nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the wind seemed to hush as if observing some sacred ritual. The snipers, once smug and confident, now watched with the reverence of apprentices before a master. And Colonel Hayes, his hands trembled around the tablet. He looked devastated, haunted, and humbled. He had failed her, misjudged her, buried her under his own arrogance. He brought a hand to his face, exhaling a breath he didn't realize he was holding. For a moment, he wasn't a commander. He was just a man watching truth unravel the illusions he had built around his authority. Seventh shot. Tink. Eighth. Tink. The sound was soft, almost delicate, but each impact was a hammer striking the walls around Hayes' pride. Ara paused before the ninth shot. The valley shifted. The wind held its breath. Dust swirled lazily, dancing in the strange quiet. She could feel something inside her tightening, some old scar tugging at the edges of her calm. 9 shots meant something. 9 had always meant something. She blinked once, slowly. She fired. Tink. 9. The silence that settled afterward wasn't anticipation anymore. It was awe, fear, respect, a strange mixture of emotions twisting in every soldier present. 949. Even in the world's calmest weather, this was a god-tier accomplishment. But Ara wasn't finished. She chambered the 10th round with a steady hand. The final challenge. The one that mattered not for the base, not for Hayes, not for the general. For herself. Because this was the shot she had once failed. The shot that had haunted her for years. The shot that had cost lives. The shot that had marked the end of her time as ghost. Her breath trembled, only slightly. She steadied it. A violent gust tore across the range, lifting a spray of dust around her like a halo of grit. She didn't fight it. She didn't curse it. She simply waited. For a moment of truth. For the valley to speak. When the wind softened, settling into a familiar rhythm, she moved. A long exhale. A heartbeat. A squeeze. The final crack split the air. 3 seconds. 3.5. The tink was softer this time, almost swallowed by distance. But it was there. The spotter screamed into his radio, hit 10, 10 for 10. A roar did erupt. Instead, silence. A heavy, reverent silence. Ara lifted her head from the rifle and slowly rose to her feet. The dust clung to her sleeves. Her hair lifted gently in the dying wind. She looked calm, controlled, almost fragile. Colonel Hayes began walking toward her, step by slow step. And for the first time since she arrived, there was no mockery in the air. No snickers, no doubt, only a stunned recognition. Hayes stopped in front of her. He looked at her rifle, the scythe, the weapon he had called junk, scrap, and embarrassment. Then he looked at Ara, the quiet woman he had cast aside. His voice didn't work, his throat tightened. So instead of words, he brought his hand up and saluted. A perfect, sharp, full salute, not from a superior officer to a subordinate, but from a soldier to a master. Every sniper followed, then every soldier on the line. One by one, a wave of salutes broke across the firing range like a silent tide. Ara returned the gesture, calm, steady, without pride. Just acceptance. But inside her chest, something she thought long dead flickered back to life. Belonging. Just a spark. But enough. Why did the applause never come, even after the impossible had been done? Because the moment wasn't meant for cheering. It was meant for silence, the kind that sinks into bone, reshapes people, and forces them to see the world differently. After the 10th perfect hit, the entire firing line stood frozen. No one dared to speak. Not even the wind seemed willing to interrupt. Ara stood amidst the dust, the heat, the disbelief, still, steady, untouched by the magnitude of what she had just done. She didn't smile, she didn't celebrate, she didn't even look proud. Inside her chest, there was only a strange stillness, a quiet echo of something long forgotten. Respect did not feel like victory. It felt like weight. It felt like memory. She lowered her rifle, her movement slow and deliberate, as if touching something fragile. The scythe rested against her shoulder like an old friend rediscovered after years of silence. Colonel Hayes stepped forward, his boots crunching softly over gravel that suddenly felt sacred. His salute still hung between them, the gesture of a man stripped of pride, holding only truth. Ara returned his salute with crisp precision, but her eyes held no triumph, only a calm acceptance, a kind of weary dignity. Hayes lowered his hand, exhaling as if he'd been holding his breath for years. Specialist, his voice cracked, the word caught somewhere between apology and awe. But Ara spared him from choosing. She simply nodded once, a gesture gentler than he deserved. She wasn't here to punish him. She wasn't here for vindication. She had been asked to shoot. So she shot. Duty, after all, had always been simple. People complicated it. General Peters approached next, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable. He studied her, not with curiosity like the soldiers, not with confusion like the snipers, and not with guilt like Hayes. His gaze carried familiarity. Recognition. Specialist Vance, he said quietly, it's been a long time. Ara's breath caught, almost imperceptibly. She knew that voice, knew it from briefing rooms, from distant winters spent on rooftops, from operations that never appeared on paper. He was one of the few who had seen her file before it became more redacted ink than text. Sir, she said simply. He offered a faint smile, respectful, contained, but undeniably present. You didn't lose it, not a bit. Ara shook her head softly. I wasn't trying to find it. A silence passed between them, full of old ghosts. Sometimes, the general said, the world has a way of reminding us who we are when we've almost forgotten. Ara didn't answer. She didn't trust her voice with memories that old, that sharp, that painfully alive. The general stepped back to give her space, space she wasn't sure she wanted. The snipers stood in rigid silence, still processing the collapse of their own certainty. Each of them looked as though they had just witnessed something divine or devastating. Finally, Sergeant Davis approached her. He was a proud man, skilled, confident, but now his pride had been replaced by humility so raw it softened his features. Specialist, he swallowed, then tried again. Ma'am. She almost smiled at the irony. A man calling her ma'am when she wore the same stripes he did. He gestured toward her rifle, then toward the distant ridge where the tiny survey plate glinted in the sunlight like a distant star. How did you do that? It wasn't mockery, it wasn't challenge. It was a plea. Ara looked out toward the mountains, toward the valley she had studied for weeks, and the one she had survived for years before that. By listening, she said softly, to the wind, to the ground, to the rifle, they all speak. Most people rush to answer before they hear the question. Davis blinked, unsure whether she was being literal or poetic. But Thorne, standing behind him, stared at her with something that looked like shame. Hours earlier, he had mocked her. Hours earlier, he had believed she was nothing but a strange woman with a broken rifle. Now he carried the weight of every word he wished he could take back. He stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Specialist, I." But Ara cut him off with a raised hand, not harshly, just gently. "You don't need to apologize." He hesitated. "I do." She looked at him, really looked, and saw not arrogance but youth, inexperience, and the eager insecurity that came from wanting to be more than you were. "It's all right," she said quietly. "Most people don't see what they're not ready to understand." Thorne lowered his eyes, humbled. For a brief moment, something like warmth flickered in Ara's chest, not pride, not triumph. Something softer, something human. But the moment passed, replaced by a familiar stillness. She gathered her rifle and nodded to the range officer. Her duty was done. Her presence was no longer needed. She slipped away quietly, leaving the stunned crowd behind as though she had always belonged in the shadows. And for the rest of that day, Fob Kestrel buzzed like an overturned hive. Did you see her setup? She didn't even use a bipod. That rifle, did you notice the stock, the bedding? Who is she? I heard the general knew her. No way, she's just logistics. Logistics doesn't shoot like that. She can't be just a specialist. She's something else. Rumors grew fast in places like this. By noon, she was a myth. By sunset, a legend. By nightfall, a ghost story whispered beneath the desert stars. Ghost. The name slipped into the barracks like a forgotten echo. A word never spoken aloud unless you had once walked in the dark places where names dissolved into missions. She heard it only once that evening. Walking past the fire pit near the wrecked tent, she caught a soldier murmuring. Ghost, they called her Ghost. The name hit her like a memory. Her steps faltered. She breathed in slow, steady, pushing the past back into its box. In the distance, the valley's winds rose again, tugging at the edges of her sleeves. As if to say, I remember you. She kept walking. Later, she sat alone in the armory, surrounded by gun oil and steel, the comforting scent of a world she once belonged to. The scythe lay disassembled across a cloth, its parts gleaming in the pale light. She touched each piece, as if reacquainting herself with a language she once spoke fluently. A stock with scars older than some soldiers. A barrel hand-treated, balanced, perfected. A scope ring misaligned on purpose, tuned to her body, her habits, her recoil pattern. She cleaned in silence, movements careful, loving, almost reverent. This wasn't about pride. It was about ritual. Memory. Identity. A soft creak of the door drew her attention. Corporal Thorne stepped in, hesitant, carrying a tray of food and a canteen. He didn't approach her directly. He set the tray on a nearby bench, his hands trembling slightly. He didn't speak. He just looked at her, not with fear but with deep, unfiltered respect. Then he nodded. A quiet apology. A quiet acknowledgement. A quiet moment she hadn't expected. When he left, Ara placed the final piece of her rifle into place, the click echoing softly in the quiet room. She sat back, closing her eyes for a moment. Not to rest, but to breathe. Once forgotten, now remembered. Once hidden, now revealed. Once dismissed, now seen. But she didn't feel triumphant. Only tired. Yet somewhere beneath that tiredness, something faint and fragile whispered. You're not done yet. Why did sleep refuse to come to her, even when the world around her finally grew quiet? Ara lay awake long after the lights went out across Fob Kestrel. The barracks buzzed softly with snores, whispered conversations tapering off, the distant hum of generators blending with the night wind. But her eyes stayed open, tracing faint cracks across the ceiling, her mind replaying moments she wished she could shut off. Not the shots. Those were simple, clean, honest. It was the silence afterward, loud, heavy, expectant, that weighed on her chest. The tension of being seen again, not as a shadow, not as the quiet outsider sweeping brass, but as something she had worked very hard to stop being. Ghost. The name had crept back onto the base like a rumor with teeth. She could feel it in the way soldiers looked at her, not with mockery now, but with something far stranger. Respect tinged with a kind of fear, as though she was something other than human, as though the woman with the broken rifle had been replaced with a myth. She hated myths. They made people forget the truth. That she bled. That she broke. That she lost things no skill could win back. She closed her eyes, willing sleep to claim her. But instead, her mind slipped back to the day everything changed. The last mission, the one hidden beneath enough redacted lines to swallow a life whole. Snow. A rooftop. A target too far to miss, until the world moved in ways no chart could predict. The explosion. The ringing in her ears. The cold that bit into her bones. The team she couldn't reach in time. She flinched as the memory surfaced, gripping the thin blanket until it twisted in her fist. The problem with being a ghost was that sometimes the only thing you truly haunted was yourself. She sat up quietly, her feet hitting the cold floor without a sound. The room was still. A few soldiers stirred, unaware of the storm inside her. She grabbed her jacket, slipped outside, and walked into the night. The valley stretched before her, silver under the moonlight. The ridge where she'd made the 10 shots shimmered faintly. Wind chattered against the empty steel plates like bones speaking in the dark. She closed her eyes and breathed. It was peaceful here. Too peaceful. It reminded her of the night before deployment, that quiet moment when the world holds still, but your heart knows a storm is coming. She leaned against the wooden post beside the range shack, letting the cold settle into her skin. The darkness didn't frighten her. It embraced her like an old friend. She didn't notice General Peters approaching until he stood beside her. He didn't say anything at first. Just stood, hands behind his back, looking out at the mountains as if reading a story written across the peaks. "You never liked being the center of attention," he said quietly. Ara's lips twitched. "Attention gets people killed." He nodded slowly. "I remember." Silence stretched between them, not awkward, not heavy, just real. "You didn't tell them," she said. "No," Peters replied. "Wasn't my place." "Then who leaked it?" He took a moment. Greatness leaks on its own. You can try to hide it, but results speak. She shook her head. "I wasn't trying to be great today." He looked at her sideways. "Then what were you trying to be?" She hesitated. The answer seemed too fragile to speak aloud, but she forced herself to say it. "Small," she whispered. Peters didn't laugh, didn't scoff. He just nodded as though he understood better than she did. "You can't be small, Ara, not anymore." She wrapped her arms around herself, staring at the moonlit valley. "I was sent here to disappear." "No," Peters said gently. "You were sent here to heal." The words landed softly, but they pierced deeper than any bullet. She swallowed hard, an ache rising in her throat. "Healing doesn't work if people keep looking," she murmured. "That's true," he admitted. "But sometimes it works when people see you clearly for the first time." Ara turned away, unable to hold his gaze. "You're not sending me back, sir," she said quietly. "I won't go." He exhaled. "I didn't come here to recruit you." Her shoulders relaxed barely. "But," he added, "I came to remind you of who you are." She shook her head. "That person died on that roof." Peter's voice softened. "Then who made those 10 shots today?" She flinched but didn't answer. "You think skill like that just remains in the body while the soul fades?" Peters asked. "You think instinct like yours works without the woman who built it?" Her breath trembled. "You're alive, Ara," he said. "I don't think you've forgiven yourself for that yet." That struck harder than she expected. Not because it wasn't true. Because it was. She didn't respond. Couldn't. Peters let the silence sit between them until it softened. Finally, he spoke again. "I'll be leaving in the morning," he said. "I don't know what you'll choose to do next, but I hope you won't hide from yourself anymore." She nodded, a small, reluctant nod she barely meant, but couldn't deny. Peters placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, not as a general to a soldier, but as a man who had seen too much loss to ignore someone drowning in it. "Ghosts don't heal in the dark," he said. "They heal when someone calls them back." And then he left, his footsteps fading into the night. Ara stayed long after he disappeared. She watched the wind move across the valley, stirring dust and shadows. She watched the mountains breathe beneath the moonlight. Slowly, she sank to the ground and rested her back against the range shack. She pulled her knees to her chest and let her head fall forward. For the first time in years, she let herself feel something other than numb. Not pain. Not fear. Not guilt. Something softer. Something dangerous. Hope. It hurt more than she expected. Later, she returned to the armory. The scythe waited on the rack, gleaming under the flickering fluorescent light. Ara touched it gently, letting her fingers rest on the cold metal. "Maybe he's wrong," she whispered. But her voice didn't sound convinced. She closed the case slowly, carefully, almost lovingly. For years, she had hidden the part of herself that could read wind like a language, that could hear a shot before it happened, that could become still enough to match the world's quietest breath. But now, that part of her had been pulled back into the light. And it was awake. Very awake. She rested her forehead against the case. "Maybe," she murmured, "I'm the one who's wrong." Outside, the wind rose again, a soft, steady whisper sweeping across the valley, as if answering. "You're not done." Why did the bass feel different the next morning, even though nothing had changed? Ara sensed it the moment she stepped outside. The air felt heavier. Conversations dropped to whispers whenever she passed. She wasn't sure if people were avoiding her or observing her. Either way, every step across the gravel felt like walking through a memory she couldn't escape. She didn't want this attention. She didn't want the glances, the awe, the awkward salutes from soldiers who yesterday laughed at her rifle. She didn't want to be the myth they whispered about over breakfast. She wanted quiet. But quiet was slow to return. As she entered the mess hall, the noise dimmed. Trays clattered a bit too late, backs straightened. Even the cooks glanced up. A knot tightened in her chest, too much, too fast, too bright. Then Corporal Thorne stepped in front of her. His face was pale but determined. His hands trembled slightly as he held out something small, a folded piece of fabric. At first she didn't understand, until she saw it was one of the barracks' cleaning cloths. Fresh, clean, neatly folded. An apology in the language of soldiers. I thought you could use this," he said quietly. Ara accepted it with a slow nod. His eyes softened, relief flooding his features. "I didn't know who you were," he admitted. "You weren't supposed to," she replied. He nodded, swallowed, then stepped aside, letting her pass without another word. The gesture didn't erase the past, but it made it easier to breathe. She sat alone in a corner, picking at her food with absent motions. Conversations resumed in hushed tones. Nobody approached her, yet she felt surrounded, boxed in by a reputation she had never wanted. So she left early. The range was empty in the morning light. A chill clung to the dirt, and the valley had not yet decided what kind of wind it would offer today. She exhaled through her nose, her breath drifting into the cold like smoke. This was where she belonged. Not among crowds. Not among fanfare. But here, where every sound had purpose and every silence had meaning. She set her rifle case on the bench, opening it slowly. The scythe gleamed in the morning sun, still flawless, still familiar, still quietly demanding. She didn't intend to shoot today. She just needed to be near it. But when she picked it up, when the stock settled into her palm, when the weight balanced perfectly against her shoulder, she felt something steady inside her shift into alignment. This wasn't a burden. This wasn't a myth. It was simply hers. Morning specialist. The voice pulled her from her thoughts. Colonel Hayes approached with measured steps, the stiffness in his posture replaced by something closer to humility. He stopped a respectful distance away, removing his cap and holding it at his side. "You're out early." Ara nodded, couldn't sleep. He let that settle, neither could I. She raised an eyebrow. He sighed, the gesture heavy with the weight of unspoken regret. "I read your file, what wasn't redacted anyway." A pause. "I owe you more than an apology." "You don't owe me anything, sir." "That's where you're wrong." His voice cracked, not with weakness, but with sincerity. "I misjudged you," he said, "not because of skill, because I never bothered to see the person standing in front of me." Ara studied him for a long moment. Yesterday, she would have ignored his words. Today, she let them land. "People see what they're comfortable seeing," she said softly. "It's human." Hayes shook his head, not an excuse. But she didn't want him to carry guilt he didn't need. Not for her, not anymore. She looked at him, her expression calm. "Colonel, you treated me the way the world taught you to treat things that don't fit. I don't blame you for that." His breath stuttered slightly, "But I do." Ara didn't respond. She didn't need to. Hayes straightened as if making a silent promise to himself, then nodded once. "If you ever need anything," he said, "you come to me directly." She inclined her head. "Thank you, sir." He left her then, giving her back the solitude she needed. For a few minutes, Ara simply stood there, holding her rifle as the wind wrapped around her like an old friend. The valley was waking, its whispers shifting, its currents changing. She listened the way she always had, deeply, fully, quietly. Then soft footsteps approached. Not heavy like Hayes. Not disciplined like the snipers. Someone younger. Corporal Thorne reappeared, holding a small notebook. Her notebook. "You dropped this yesterday," he said, offering it carefully. "I didn't open it." She took it gently. "Thank you." He hesitated. "Specialist, could you teach me?" Ira blinked, startled. "Teach you what?" she asked. He gestured toward the ridge. "Not shooting, not yet, just what you see when you look at the wind." His voice trembled with honesty. "Because yesterday I realized something. I don't know half as much as I thought. And you see things we don't." Ara glanced at the valley, then back at him. "Teacher." She hadn't taught anyone anything in years. She wasn't sure she even remembered how. But the uncertainty in Thorne's eyes wasn't fear, it was hope. Hope she wasn't sure she deserved to crush. So she nodded once. "Fine, show me what you think you know." His face brightened, but only for a moment. She pointed at a patch of sagebrush halfway to the ridge. "What's the wind doing there?" Thorne squinted. Blowing left." "Wrong," she said softly. "Updraft, look closer." He blinked, confused. "How can you tell?" Ara gestured. "The dust rises, not drifts. The leaves twist differently in an upcurrent than a crosswind. Don't guess, listen." Thorne tried again, and again, and again. Each time she corrected him, gently, patiently, surprising even herself with how easily the old lessons returned. By the time the sun reached its peak, 3 more soldiers had wandered over, pretending not to stare, then eventually asking questions. By noon, 7 stood behind her. By afternoon, the entire sniper team. Davis approached last, swallowing pride like a bitter pill. "Specialist, will you help us understand what we're missing?" Ara looked at their faces, tired, frustrated, humbled, but open. For the first time since her arrival, she didn't feel like a ghost in their presence. She felt present. "All right," she said, "but we start from zero." They nodded. She began. The sun shifted overhead. The wind changed directions. Hours passed. Soldiers came and went, but the circle around her never grew smaller. And as the day waned, something inside her began to soften, a recognition that maybe she didn't have to remain invisible. Maybe she didn't have to choose between disappearing and becoming a myth. Maybe there was a middle path, one where she could exist as herself, unchanged, unhidden. As the last light slipped across the valley, Ara packed her rifle, her movements slow, thoughtful. Corporal Thorne lingered nearby, suddenly bashful. "Specialist," he said softly. "What do we call someone who can hit a 2,000-yard plate 10 times in a row?" Ira paused. She looked at the valley, the wind, the ridge, the students who had gathered around her today, and the quiet inside her that, for the first time in years, didn't feel hollow. "You don't need to call me anything," she said. Thorne smiled. "We do, just not Ghost anymore." She thought about it, about the past, about the present, about the weight she carried, and the weight she had finally begun to put down. Then she answered quietly, "Just call me Ara." That night as she returned to her bunk, she felt something unfamiliar, not heaviness, not isolation, not numbness. Something lighter. Not joy exactly, but the possibility of it. And as she lay in the quiet darkness, listening to the soft breaths of the soldiers around her, she let herself believe in something she had denied for a very long time. A second chance. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. And sometimes, when the world least expects it, it returns.